Hi, I'm Amanda Lannert from Jellyvision, bringing you a session on what's next with work, reimagining leadership, collaboration, and culture building in a post-COVID world. I have assembled quite the panel of experts who are all rock stars in their own right, and I'm going to ask them to each kick it off by introducing themselves, giving a little blurb about what the company does, the number of employees you have, and your experience with remote work. Is it new, your old hat, blended model? Just let us know sort of your perspective. And let's start off with Matt. Again, what does Forager do? How many employees do you have? And what's your experience with remote work?
Sure. So I'm Matt Silver. I'm co-founder and CEO of Forager. We're a logistics technology company based in Chicago, focused on automating cross-border shipping within North America. For us, we were not remote before coronavirus. We had two remote employees that we had hired, one as a sales rep, one as an engineer, and it was more so because we kind of just had to deal with it for the time being. My perspective has done a complete 180 in terms of having a distributed workforce, and so we're at 54 people now. We were, I think, around 35 when we went remote, so we've hired a lot in the last couple months, and it's making me rethink what we're going to do, 6 months from now when things might start getting back to normal.
Amazing. I can't wait to hear about your lessons learned about remote onboarding. Colleen, love to hear from you.
Yes, so my name is Colleen Curtis. I'm the head of community at the Mom Project, so digital talent marketplace that connects moms with world-class companies, focused on flexibility even before the era of coronavirus. My remote work history is somewhat varied. So I spent 10 years at Yelp in their community org and was fully remote from the mothership for those 10 years, managing an entirely distributed team. My last couple of years, a team of 150 across 27 countries. So not only with remote experience, but also cross-cultural remote, which causes a lot of growth for everyone. We were in an office at the Mom Project. So it was very much a 4 days in office culture before coronavirus with some distributed employees. And so it was really the first time in really my career that I had ever gone to an office most of the time. And I really actually loved it. And so now we're back to, fully remote, fully distributed. And we're wrestling with those questions too of, do we need to come back to an office full time? So.
Sam.
Hi guys, my name is Sam Pessin. I'm one of the founders of a company called Remote Year. We run work and travel programs for people who have remote jobs to give them a transformational experience. And similar to the product we offer, we've been dog fooding for a while and have been fully remote since day one. So we started about 5 years ago in Chicago as well, although we are now fully distributed all over the world and all over the country. We grew the team to a maximum of about 120 team members at one time, with also about 25 countries covered there, maybe 30 countries covered. We're a little bit smaller now based on changes because of COVID, but that was where we maxed out a few months ago. So that's a little bit about us. And
last but not least, Brian.
Hey, Brian Fritton. I'm the CEO, founder at Havoc Shield. Havoc Shield guides small business teams through securing a remote workforce wherever they are without having to be a security expert. You can think of it a little bit like TurboTax for small biz cybersecurity. We're 2 employees today, so very early. Just came out of Techstars in April, but I previously led engineering and IT for Civis Analytics in town, so that was a larger team. I consider myself a bit of an introvert, so work from home actually for me has been quite easy. Been doing it for quite some time. And my experience with it organizationally is from an operational point of view. How do we create an environment for employees that makes it comfortable and flexible while designing systems of work that allow us to still hit goals in doing that?
So you as an introvert made the transition pretty easily. Maybe there's some extroverts on the phone. What I'd love to hear is what of this insane experience of going from largely in the offices to completely in your home and not allowed to leave. What's one thing you've learned about this experience as a leader and as a human being that may have surprised you the most? Sam, you want to take a shot at that? What have you learned that has been surprising?
You get used to it. I mean, at the beginning, it was hard for me for sure. I'm actually on the middle of the EI spectrum. So I struggled a little bit at the beginning. And I think a lot of the things that I heard from people in the last couple of months around, hey, this has been super hard. I can't interact in person and collaborate with my coworkers. You kind of just get used to it at some point. And I think it becomes a lot easier to just be fully remote and be on Zoom all day, be on calls all day, and find what you need from social interactions elsewhere, either through more casual coworker interactions or through personal interactions with people in your life that are physically near you.
So Matt, you went from bustling in the office, you pulled up a miracle and closed your round in the middle of a pandemic, and now you're onboarding, 50% of the company size. They've never seen the office. What are some of the tools, the practices, the assumptions, the lessons you've learned from COVID are you going to bring back to work when we're all finally allowed to leave our houses once again? What's going to stick?
So the biggest impact I think has been, well, for me personally, it's been that I don't have people barging into my office with questions that other people know how to answer. Early on, it was everybody thought I was the only person with the answer to any question. And so moving us away from that and getting it to where you have to rely on other people because I might not respond right away, I think has been impactful. And once we go back into some form of an office setting, hopefully we'll be at the point where people feel more dependent on either their manager or their coworkers and less on having to run to me about everything. So the biggest thing that I would say will change drastically for us is sales visits versus doing video calls. It's so much cheaper to get on Zoom and talk to a customer. It's so much more efficient. It's so much easier to be able to demo something. You don't have to worry about whether you can hook up to whatever system they have at their office. We have customers in 3 countries, US, Mexico, and Canada. So having people traveling to Mexico and in Canada and going all over the United States, it's allowed us to be more efficient, obviously, with our time. I did demos for 3 different customers in one day last week. And there's no way I would have been able to do that traveling and seeing those customers. And I would have been burning a day before and a day after to actually travel. So that would be the biggest impact. Obviously, the Zoom and Slack, we set up Slack well before we moved remote. So we already had that environment set up. Zoom meetings for internal conversations would obviously go away once we have an office, but yeah, I would say the sales component is the biggest impact.
Yeah, I used to tell myself stories that whenever something was wrong, we needed to get into a room, and it turns out Zoom rooms are just as good, and they save you about 9 hours of travel, which is pretty great. I got a question for Colleen, where you've now run entirely remote workforces, and there's a difference between everyone's at home on Zoom, and some people are in the office on Zoom, and some people are at home. I think that there's actually it's like sort of the worst of both worlds when it's split. We used to have Zoom rooms for our 10% of remote employees who just sort of started at Jellyvision and then took their jobs with them when they moved. And there is a dynamic of when everyone is looking at each other and you're looking at them from Zoom looking at each other. What are you going to bring back to work with you? As some people go back to work and some don't, what are going to be rules about technology? What rules about community building? Like, how are you going to sort of thread the needle where things work really well when everyone's remote? Things work really well when you're in the office and sort of an in-faces environment. What are best practices, and how are we going to survive and thrive when it's 50-50 or some combination thereof?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's one I've been kind of wrestling with. Going back to my Yelp days, our group, which was fairly large, was fully remote. But the company was not. So they had offices headquartered in San Francisco and New York. And so if you were like on the leadership team and relatively new to that, and then of course my husband puts the printer on right now, and that's remote work, right? And you have to be the only person who are like projected on this huge screen to a room of people with a delay. Like, it's a very bad dynamic, right? Like, you feel uncomfortable, you don't talk up, you won't speak up as much. They don't know to call in. You have somebody to say there's no body language and there's no cues. I think when we go back to 50-50, which I think is going to be the dynamic, it's something we're kind of acutely aware of in terms of, the childcare crisis of folks that, even if they have the option, aren't going to be able to come back maybe as quickly as those without children, right? And so what we've been working on is really a best practice around, okay, if we have a split group in a meeting, remote and non-remote, how are we building inclusion into those meetings, even if it's 3 or 4 people, right? And so a lot of that can be done with, at the top of the meeting, we restate sort of like, what are the rules of engagement for a meeting that has both remote and non-remote employees, right? And it could be something as easy as, okay, I'm going to be in charge of opening the floor to the remote employees to ensure that like I'm reading their signals, or they're going to be able to Slack me when they have something to say. Whatever those things are that can become part of the thread and the fabric of how you do business internally, I think is going to be really important, because right now we can't have this dynamic where the folks inside are able to read each other's cues ultimately trump the folks that are, kind of remote. Because what we've seen with these fully remote gallery view Brady Bunch experiences is that everyone's in the same boat, so everyone feels either equally as awkward and uncomfortable or equally as positive about it, right? And so I think setting up those kind of rules of engagement for remote work and then making sure that those are reinforced is going to help kind of even the playing field for remote and non-remote.
Amanda, can I add one quick thing to that?
Please.
Early on in our journey, we created what ended up being the fundamental rule of meetings at Remote Year, which we call the all or nothing rule, which basically means either everybody's in person or everybody's on Zoom. And it's just that simple for any meeting. We were five of the 6 of us were traveling with the program and managing everything on the ground. And one of the 6 of us in the early days was in Latin America planning for some months down the road. And he would just dial into every meeting. And he called me and he was like, this is not working. Like, I can't make my points. I can't engage. We've all been that person, right? You've been the one person on the conference call, or you've been in the room with that one person on the conference call who you're just like, it's really hard for them to engage. So we made that rule really early on where everybody is on their own computer. So we actually sat the 5 of us in one room around the same table on our own Zooms playing the mute game while that one person was on Zoom in Latin America. And we've done that ever since. And that's been one of our biggest simple rules.
But Sam, to push it further, you're really good at sending people to different time zones where asynchronous work is probably more helpful than having people, get up at 3 a.m. and be done with their day at noon. Are we at the age where we're going to challenge the workday itself and really move to asynchronous work, more documentation, things like that? Or is like, we're still going to make it work sort of 9 to 5 as best we can, understanding people may not come back to work, but that doesn't mean they're not going to go to Bali. It could be that like people aren't just in their basements anymore. Does work itself need to change versus just the tools that enable communication? What's your experience when you send people to Bali? Is it more becoming a company like Basecamp where everything's written down and it's all about asynchronous collaboration?
It depends on the role so much for that. There are some roles where your manager needs to be on duty for the exact hours that you're working, right? And there's some roles where you could have 1 hour of overlap every day, and that's totally fine. So for us, we basically, for meetings across continents, we had Tuesday and Wednesday mornings from, I think it was like 9 to 11 a.m. Eastern time, which were our dedicated global meeting times, which by the way, wasn't a great system because that's like very late night in Asia always. But because we had a lot more people in the Western hemisphere, we just did it that way, but that was definitely something we could have improved. I think the synchronous, asynchronous thing is extremely role dependent for us.
All right, well, let's talk about communication. I'd love to start with Brian. How does communication to the company, the cadence, the format, and modalities change when everyone's remote? How should it change to really drive effective alignment when people are all over and in different places thinking different things at different times?
Yeah, I think it stitches right back to that asynchronicity, right? I think that people have to become better writers and readers. The cadence, I'm not sure matters as much as the engagement with that cadence, right? So making sure that folks are subscribed to when they're providing updates, and I think it's important for the business to provide that space as well, right? You have to communicate that writing effectively and taking in information takes real time, and businesses sometimes like to move to the next thing and the next meeting, and you have to provide time for synthesis and writing itself. And that time used to be filled with meetings and follow-ups anyway, so it's a good use of time. I believe that access to information, to communications on various projects, the company health, like all levels need to be probably more permissive inside the organization than they used to be as well. So I would call it something like an opt-in, communication culture, where if you want to know about something, you can head to where it's stored, whether that's Wiki or some other system, where if you want to know about something, you can head there and read about it rather than asking on Slack and asking someone to repeat themselves for the third time. And then you can also subscribe to updates too, right? So that's the tertiary value of written communication is as things get updated, usually if you're using some sort of good tool like Guru or Notion or something like that, you can subscribe. And so when it gets updated, you kind of get the delta of that information.
So, communication is a two-way street. One, there's broadcast. We hear a lot of themes about, doing more things in more ways and providing more context, but there's also listening. And this is sort of like the genesis of why I reached out on LinkedIn, is that I am missing water cooler talks that aren't about your dog and banter, but I would hear perspectives or hear about challenges. It's a 300-person plus organization. I would learn about the business. And now that we're fully remote, if I set up a meeting on someone's calendar just to hear what's going on, it's not pleasant. It's one thing to organically be getting coffee at the same time I am, where I get to hear. It's another to extract information where people are like, oh my goodness, am I getting fired? Which may say more about me than work from home. But how do you listen constantly, formally and informally, organically and inorganically? What is the mechanism of listening, and how does that change when people are remote or working asynchronously? And how can you do a better job at it than I am?
I can answer that. So we have team channels for everything on Slack. So I'm in most of them actually, and I usually don't say much other than where I can help. I try not to be like dad yelling at everybody and because then they lose trust in being in that group and being able to see that and getting yelled at about stuff. And so for sales, for example, I'll see somebody will ask a question. We just hired 7 or 8 or 9 new sales reps over the last month. And so I see a lot of questions that are like, how would you go about, getting a yes after a no kind of thing? And I'll comment to try to help there where I can, but more often than not, I'm just reading and paying attention. And we have a water cooler channel also, but that's more like the fun side of things. And so I do know that, our CTO, for example, is desperately wanting to be back in an office with his team, so that communal conversation that happens where you hear someone talking about something, but somebody else actually listens also and they learn. I think we are missing out on that. And so one thought was maybe getting a smaller office for engineering at one point sooner than a full-time office. And then the other part is sales. If you have, it's really in sales and our supply side development team, but you have one person on the phone, you hear them say something that you pick up and you use that the next time you're selling, or those coaching moments that just happen on the spot where other people can learn from that because they're sitting around the other people and they don't have, plastic or glass shields between each other, which is something that people talk about needing.
Sneeze guards everywhere.
Yeah, everyone's got a face guard. You can't hear anything. But allowing the kind of banter to happen and the back and forth to be able to learn from, I think, is the biggest thing that we're missing out on right now. And it's not like we all want to have just like, if anybody knows that new app Clubhouse, like if we had Clubhouse literally all the time every day with the company where you just hear everybody's chatter all day, that might be a different story. But I don't think we want that either. I think that just gets noisy. So that is the biggest thing we're missing out on is the teaching or coaching moments, and getting that pulse, obviously, like you touched on.
Yeah, I have something to add. It's good. So I agree. Like part of, a lot of the work I was doing as we were building and kind of scaling the company. Also, Matt, is that Fuel Collective that you have in the background?
Fuel Collective.
Yeah, it literally looks like the old office we used to
be. Yeah, because the Mom Project used to be in the
yeah.
I mean, I'm not in the office right now. If you can.
I know, I could tell. Yeah, it's like a Zoom background. I was like,
yeah,
we were sat right where you were sitting.
Yeah, we had that whole side of the office.
That's so great. Okay. And so I used to get a ton of kind of peripheral feedback as we were growing the team and growing the business. And, people felt comfortable with me because I was there every day and they would drop by my desk and we, the same, we get coffee. I was like known, I think I solely supported Foxtrot in River North. So like I was always there and people felt really comfortable. And I did really miss that because particularly around like community and the brand and communications, I was getting a lot of really good feedback from people that, don't necessarily work on that part of the business, but have really valid input. And so I instituted office hours, which are literally just like anyone can come. And I joke that it's called Foxtrot, but that people just drop in because they want to give me their feedback. And it's slightly more formalized than like you run into someone and you just get their point of view. But, like sometimes there'll be one other person in me and we kind of have a one-on-one, and there are other times where like big stuff's happening, like this past week or the week before, or work from home with kids. It was a big, moment for, working parents. And I would have like 20 people show up, and then we would do the Zoom breakout. So people would give each other their feedback, and then I would be with a smaller group and be able to kind of take the feedback. But I've often found that, I can route some of the feedback remotely by just being in the right, building relationships with the right people. I think, it's probably more difficult as a CEO of a bigger company. But that ultimately, like when people feel like that they're not in trouble, right? Like I'm sure when you drop a meeting on someone's calendar and you're the CEO, they're like, oh my God, like heart palpitations. Like I probably have the same response to our CEO. But I think when you have these like regular, almost like office hours where it feels very non-threatening and they're able to come and drop in, and I found that by and large they've been extremely positive too. And so I have them recurring on every Friday.
Yeah, that's what I'm going to ask you. So what is important to do? What's the hygiene that makes them work? Is it same time predictability? Is it moving it around so it works for everybody? Is it spontaneous? Like what's the hygiene that makes someone have successful office hours versus just showing up to an empty Zoom room again and again?
I think that they feel, I do at the same time every week. On Fridays, I just kind of like use those of my no kind of meeting day, and I do it relatively early in the morning. And so we kind of start with coffee, and it's like literally office hours. I do same time, same place. I've only gotten a little bit of feedback of people that were like, the time doesn't work for me, and I just set up another one with them because it was like important enough. And to me, it's just like, I put it out there that like, I'm just available and I'm there. And if they show up, great. And if they don't, I'll just be in the Zoom room getting work done until someone wants to pop in and have coffee with me. But I think the hygiene, like being aware of it, but also being flexible, right? Like if no one shows up week after week, like obviously it's not a great tool. I think once I started doing it and people started hearing like, oh no, this is really great. Like this is how you get, because what it used to happen is people just used to drive by my desk at the office. That's also not terribly productive for me as someone who was trying to get a lot of work done. And so this allowed me to sort of like condense people's energy into one space, and they really sort of play off each other as well, which I appreciate, because then they're building relationships that they might not have had either.
So that works well for office. So let's go to Sam and talk a little bit. When you have a fully remote workforce, do you ever get together in faces? And if so, like, how do you make the most of the time? What is the purpose of that time? And how do you make it, feel not forced? I mean, I'm sure that there are all kinds, like, can you talk about like when you're remote, if we don't go back to the offices, what is the role and structure to be effective about actually getting people together in a room once in a while?
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that. And just really quick on the previous question, I think for me as a CEO, especially of a larger company, the key is just making yourself approachable to your team, because I think what you're really talking about is like your conversations with individual contributors, because you have access to your leaders and maybe even their direct reports, but it's really more like the sales reps, what are they saying? And, the operations people, what are they saying? And I think if you early on in their career make the effort to actually connect, and I don't know if you can do it with every single person, but with them somehow, they will feel much more comfortable slacking you and saying, hey, Amanda, how about this idea? You want to chat about it for a few minutes? And that actually happened in our case because we really made a ton of effort toward connecting with every single person on the team. So I think that's one small thing that might enable a little bit more of what you're talking about, but it's still not a perfect thing. In terms of in-person, I'm a strong believer in the value of in-person meetings, even for a fully remote team. When we first started Remote Year, we were like remote work extremists. We were like, never meet in person, remote all the time. Like there's no reason to meet in person ever. And I actually don't believe that anymore. I think there is a lot that you gain from 2, 3, 4 days of really high quality in-person time. We usually use that for two things. One is strategic planning, and two is culture building, which is just sort of having fun together and building relationships. And so what we do is we have this rhythm throughout every level of the organization, where you have a strategic touch point in person, and then you operate remotely for 3 months, 6 months, a year, depending on what team you are and how much budget we have for you to meet up in person, how frequently. But those in-person touch points, I believe, are critical to building the relationship that then carries you through your journey working remotely together and keeping track of the goals that you set when you're in person. It just fires everybody up, and that energy lasts not forever, but for a good amount of time.
Now, because of the breakthrough in technology, teams, they're working pretty collaboratively. Like we hear, like, between Zoom and Slack and even whiteboards through Zoom, like, people are collaborating. But how are you guys building camaraderie across teams? Like, how are you building, a broader vibe when you're not just working with people day in and day out? Matt, you have all these new employees. How are you making them feel part of a tribe? Brian, it's you, a bunch of nerdy introverts. How are you making them feel like part of a tribe? Can you speak to, like, specific actions around building camaraderie and community when everybody's remote?
We've been doing a lot of happy hours to an extent where I keep getting yelled at for attending these happy hours instead of spending time with my wife. But we do them at least once a week. So, like, I think this week we're doing let me see. At some point we're doing a dueling pianos thing, trivia night this Thursday. So every week we have something a little bit different that we do that brings people together. It's usually not 50 people or even 20 people that do it. It usually ends up being a handful of, like, 10, 15, 20 people that might do it. And so it's usually not like, oh, all the engineers showed up for this. It's like some junior engineer, a sales rep, like, I'm on there, Sarah, our head of people ops, is on there. Like, we'll have this kind of random collection of people. And so that does help build it that way. We've also, the engineering team started using an app or a plugin in Slack called Donut that pairs people up. And then I know Chicago Ventures has been pairing people up between portfolio companies. But I do think as we start to get a little bit bigger, we're going to spend a little bit more time focused on allowing people to get to know each other, so that we don't have that typical, engineering against sales side of things, and have a lot more engagement across those groups, specifically because of how, like, all of our salespeople at some point or another worked at a logistics company besides somebody that came from Paro. And everybody else on the engineering side doesn't know anything about logistics. And so allowing them to get to know each other, get to learn from each other, but also just from the human component, we've got people that live by themselves. And so enabling them to be able to have some sort of social engagement that's not related to, like, did you call enough carriers today, I think is really valuable.
Who sets up the event? Who themes it? Who picks it? Is it crowdsourced and it's rotating ownership, or is it like company HR picks a theme? Like, how does that work?
Our head of marketing happens to be one of the most incredible, like, social oriented, like, thinkers, I guess, when it comes to those types of events. She's become the default person in charge of that. Now Sarah, who runs people ops, has also started to get involved in that, and we do some crowdsourcing. Like, the dueling pianos thing was my idea because I have a friend that does that, and I paid to watch him do it separately, and I thought, okay, let's just get him to come and do it for the company. But anytime people start suggesting ideas, as long as they don't, there's still the issue of everybody feeling embarrassed by suggesting an idea they think is stupid. And so, like, we don't get that a whole lot, but we're starting to get more and more of that. And I told them I'm fine with budgeting for doing it a couple times a week if it makes sense. It's still cheaper than throwing a party where you spend $10,000 on booze.
Awesome, thank you. Brian, how do you build camaraderie? Have you heard about Donut, the app, and these spontaneous meetings? How do you do it? And how have you done it in your past?
Well, I really want to do the dueling pianos thing. That sounds awesome. I think, any of the triggers that you can kind of build in, like Donut, are really great, that get people in the same Zoom room, at least remotely. But I think this is often where, like, just seeing other humans live beats any sort of process or technology, and doing that in smaller or less expensive ways more frequently, whether that's an offsite or like a regional cohort to get together that people from Wisconsin and Michigan and Indiana get together once a quarter somewhere. And it doesn't matter what their role is, get together and do something. I think those bonds can sustain for quite a long time. And then I also think about, how do you level the playing field when you get back into the office, right? So camaraderie remote is tough, but you can also leave a lot of people feeling like they don't belong to the company anymore when people come back too. And so when you do the happy hours and you do the free lunches and things like that, I think it's really important to be disciplined as a leader about what are my continuing to be remote employees going to get too, right? Like, are they going to get a delivery? Can we arrange for something like that? Can we put a free Zoom room up on the cafe projector so that people can kind of come and enter the room and just kind of watch what's going on? Or, can you get them some booze? There's lots of new booze delivery apps. So I think just making sure that you continue to level the playing field between people that are now re-entering the office and people that are staying remote is important, because you have to keep that playing field for people to feel involved.
I want to keep going about, how do you track and measure morale in a fully remote, but let's just start off by defining the role of managers. How does the role of managers need to change when you're not in faces and checking in and doing, physical stand-ups every day? Colleen, you want to take that one? What's the role of managers in a fully remote environment?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's become so much more critical that you can gauge the temperature of your team, right? Because you don't have this ability to sort of be sitting next to them. You don't have the ability to read their face all the time. And one of the things, and I wouldn't say I will adopt donut. I just looked that up. That's awesome. I wouldn't say I adopt like new things all the time, but what I was finding the need for once we went remote was this asynchronous stand up. And so we implemented Geekbot. And I liked it so much because we were able to, it's nimble enough and it's easy enough for everyone to do because we heavily use Slack. And so it integrates into Slack, and it basically creates this opportunity every day where asynchronously they're able to talk to each other in a way that is a bit formulaic, but they end up using 2 or 3 of the questions, which are a little bit more morale focused, to give each other shout outs, to like do things that I did not anticipate that they would be doing. And when I can read the tone of those, I start to feel like, okay, people are really last week, like people are having a really hard time last week with everything that was going on. And it was like very evident in some of those answers. And so in a way, it's like a comfortable space to have the temperature check without me being your manager coming like, how are you? Like, how are you doing? Like, it's still really important. I think as a remote manager, the ability to convey and read tone becomes like such an outsized amount of the work in the communication, right? So as Brian was saying about being able to clearly articulate via writing and, being a great writer and being able to communicate, like the tone is so important in terms of how people feel about what you're saying and their ability to interpret it. And as managers, like if you are fully reliant on being able to be in a room and see someone and kind of be next to them to convey your tone, like you ultimately have to take all the accountability as a manager for how your communication is received. And I think that's like that radical accountability of, if you misunderstood me or you didn't understand what was happening, if I just take extreme accountability for that, we can move forward together, right? Like you can't keep doing that. But, ultimately managers, I think, are going to be responsible for so much more than, the KPIs, right? Because the people that are making up all of their, all of the work that's getting done ultimately need different things as a remote workforce that aren't so easily duplicated as they are in an office. So
could I add something to that real quick too? I love the idea that you have to be there to understand the feeling of your employees and the anxiety level, the stress level, the engagement level. One thing that worked really well when I was leading engineering at Civis, and it wasn't even remote, but this would work so well remotely, is getting past I'm fine, right? So we all have these one-on-one conversations, and a lot of them just start and stop with, how you doing? I'm fine. And it's tough as a manager to get past it. And now it's, as Colleen was saying, so much more important that you get past it. And so one thing that Claire Liu, who runs Know Your Team, wrote a big post about, and I operationalized and worked really well, was energy tension conversations. And so it's just asking specifically, and it does get a little awkward sometimes, but you can head that off by saying, hey, we're going to have one of these types of conversations this week. Do some thinking on what's causing you stress and what when you felt most in flow this last week, and those types of questions to sort of break that glass of just that I'm fine response and get down to more the nitty gritty of, what are you frustrated by, and what can we do more to make you feel more in flow, and what kind of support can we do to give you that. So I think getting in the habit of having some sometimes awkward conversations to get past I'm fine, your people will really appreciate. And then, you'll have a couple and people will accept it as the norm. I think that helps a lot.
So there's a lot going on for leadership right now. People are stuck in their homes. There are terribly troubling headlines. These are really difficult times. So say you do ask, how are you doing? And people say, I'm not fine. What's the role of leadership during quarantine? And how do you help people sort of navigate Zoom fatigue and loneliness or child fatigue or whatever's going on? Like what can you as an employer do, staying in your lane of having respect for boundaries when people are stuck at home? How have you successfully helped people? And what are strategies that anyone can employ to help people who maybe aren't doing well? Admit they're not fine. What do you do?
Yeah, I can jump in. I think this is, heightened the necessity for leadership and employers to approach every employee with empathy, right? Like we're currently dealing with, particularly around the pandemic and then the more recent events, like things that nobody who's managing has ever really done as a manager or as a parent or as an employee, right? And so in some ways, I think what's been really powerful is seeing, and we've done this internally, but also seeing other leaders do this, is just admitting that we don't know the answers, but also knowing that our folks that are struggling aren't maybe going to be able to identify what would be most helpful to them in this moment, right? And so they're so stressed that it's almost like we have to do these listening sessions and then start to come back with ideas. Like I have a single mom with twin 5-year-old boys at home. She's like a super high producer, really, really awesome. But I'm like, how is she doing this? This is crazy. And she wouldn't really, we were having a hard time kind of like getting into the thing, because she really, I think, wanted to show that she could do it all. And I just was like, I think what might be helpful is if we remove all of our kind of extraneous meetings and you're able to work like in a more async way, and you can work at night and whatever you need to do to. And she was like visibly like, oh my gosh, are you sure that would be like the thing that would be okay? And I was like, we don't know the answers. Like if you can perform in that way, and like a little bit of it, I think, is letting go of some of the things we used to think about what people needed, and listening and being able to come up collaboratively with some solutions that really help people, because right now we're just experiencing a lot of stress that I think is out of the norm, right? Like we used to have sort of buckets of stress that made sense to us as managers because we could empathize as employees, and we don't have that anymore.
So funny enough, it always comes back to still just be human. So let's talk on the opposite end of the spectrum, celebrating. I'm noisy. Matt knows that. I'm noisy. I make a lot of noise. And when something goes well, I'm like shouting in the hallways and usually trying to get someone to have a drink with me. And I'm sorry, it's true. Maybe I'm a lush, but I'll be like, let's go get a drink. Can't even high five anymore. And I mean like ever. I think high fives and handshakes are dead. And that's part of like one of the things we're going to grieve about COVID is you can't high five anyone. Anyone got some great examples of how you celebrate. And I will say I have a bias against like software that's like, give a fellow employee a gold star. I don't like things that infantilize work. Am I wrong? Should I infantilize work and like get those like kudos systems? How are you effectively celebrating when you can't high five and you can't get a drink, which are my two, old standbys? What do you do?
Celebrating, one of the things that we actually just decided to kick off is every Monday morning when we do the morning stand up to kick off the week. We were just talking about this earlier today. We're going to actually nominate different people based on something that they did the previous week to kind of lead the stand up and at least encourage them to be vocal and allow them to do that. There's only so much you can do to celebrate things besides posting about it, writing something about it. I think one of the things that I've tried to do as a leader and a CEO has been to be really honest and transparent with people. And that has been something that's evolved a lot over the last 1.5 years or 2 years, where I've gone from trying to keep everything a secret to just being open and transparent, knowing that the worst thing that happens is someone doesn't like my answer and they leave because they don't like the direction of the company. And I'm glad they made the decision now instead of a year later when they figure out that's where we're going. So from the very beginning of going remote, I've talked about the fact that I think it's going to be a long time before we'll be back in an office. And I've tried to prepare people for that. And so the same thing on the opposite end, when I bring up information about something that someone's done, they carry more weight than like, at Coyote, we had MVPs every quarter. And by the time that I left Coyote and we had a PDF that got sent out that had probably 45 pages of MVP awards from everybody in every office and every department, and every page had multiple people on it. And so it carried way less weight that you'd win an MVP because you were one of 500 people that won it out of 3,000 employees. And so trying to put an emphasis on when there's an actual win to celebrate it, being strict about what you actually do celebrate, so that when you do celebrate it, it's that much more impactful, like celebrating anniversaries instead of birthdays. Doing stuff like that, I think, carries a lot of weight with people because they actually value it when they actually hear that feedback.
Awesome.
Slack emojis.
Sam, please, you want to jump
Slack
into
emojis. It's all about Slack emojis.
Okay.
No, really, and Slack comments. Like I really think that that's a super easy, organic way to give that feedback to people, especially as an executive of the company. Like maybe a manager posts something that one of their team members did, or maybe that person posts something that they did themselves, and for you to engage with an emoji, and sometimes either a "Hey, awesome job" or a question. That sounds really cool. Did you think about this? And leave some feedback. I think that goes miles and miles and miles, not only with that employee, but with everybody else looking at that and reading that and seeing your level of engagement with them.
So we're coming down the home stretch, but I'd be remiss if I didn't tap our resident security expert and say, Brian, you have the mic. If we end up going back to work, some of us and some of us don't, and the rest of us go to Bali, what do we need to know about security if people stop working from home or the office, but really work from anywhere? And Sam says, come to Bali. What are the lessons?
From home and you have some people working from the office is the amount of infrastructure and different ways you're keeping your data safe and you're complying with regulations and all those sorts of things. They just grow because not only do you have your inside the office infrastructure and stuff to deal with, but you've got everyone's home office, right? And everyone's different router configuration and kids working on your computers and stuff like that. The top 10 tips and tricks things that I think will add a couple of good layers are 2-factor everywhere. Just make sure that if any service you use supports it, that you have it. And if the service doesn't support it, probably look for another one because you're bound to get an account takeover there. And then I think take some time to actually read up on how to change insecure router settings and get a better password. And then lastly, use a password manager, unique passwords for everything. So if one service gets hacked or they're storing your password in plain text and you use that everywhere else, that's bad news. And so use a password manager. They're so easy nowadays. Almost all of them are free individually. I think those are probably the top 3 that I'd recommend. And then make it clear what your policies are as an employer. Make sure that people know how to interact with it, how they can report an incident. So don't make it a scary thing, and make it super easy, and don't make people feel dumb if they do report something that isn't an incident. Make sure that you can explain to them that it's good to keep their eyes open and why that one wasn't an incident, but why the next one might be.
Amazing. Thank you for that free consulting.
One thing I want to toss out there, and I'm not an advocate for it because I haven't started using it yet, but we just got set up with Rippling, which helps with some of that stuff to not having 50 different accounts that you have to set up separately, and it does some sort of password saving thing. But I'm excited to start using it because I think it will help us, and I'll let you guys know if it actually works. Yeah,
single sign-on is great too.
So new security, new feeling sharing. We're talking about feelings. What else do we need to unlearn about work? What mindsets and acquired behaviors will limit future success given the shifts in behaviors we're all undergoing in our basements? What do we got to unlearn about work? Brian, start with you.
A lot of it, I think, returns to treat people on the same playing field no matter where they are, right? So in order to do that, you have to be disciplined yourself about making sure that they can access the information you're putting out there. And so it comes back to that asynchronicity, right? And making sure that what people need to know is accessible by them. Other than that, I leave it to the other types of professionals that have really set this up, like the Mom Project, to speak more on that.
Yeah, Colleen, what do we need to unlearn about work?
I think the biggest thing we have to unlearn about work is our definition of flexibility, and what people really need to thrive is can be quite individual, but what's personal is universal in some ways, right? And so for a very long time, we've been forcing structures that we felt like were the way, and the future of work is going to be more flexible and more adaptable to how people actually best perform. And then so as managers and as companies, the quicker we can also adapt alongside people's needs and really understand what those are and how we can best get the best out of people, like those are the companies that are going to do best as we move forward. And I think we just have to unlearn a lot of the insecurities that frankly we're clinging to, like in office must be, and rigid schedules, and corporate travel, and some of these things that are just like, maybe we don't need them. Maybe we never have to return to them because they weren't working for people. And we could really allow for, I think, this awakening in, the corporate world on, this is the way that's going to work for people, and people are what drive the business.
Sam or Matt, got anything?
Yeah, I would. It's definitely causing me to rethink how we set the business up, honestly, how we set the people up. We've already been thinking about hiring a lot in Mexico because of the fact that we're focused on it, and the cultural impact of having people in Mexico, I think, is valuable. But the biggest thing that I've started to think about literally right now has been the comment I made earlier about making engineering and sales kind of more collaborative or involved with each other. Also at the same time, kind of might separate a little bit more, because sales, if you're calling companies that ship stuff, you need to be calling them during the time that they're actually in an office. If you're writing code and you're working with, you're building the platform side of things out, then your schedule doesn't quite matter so much. And so how I work with our CTO on getting to the point where his team could potentially be distributed, and where that can go, and trying to learn from some of these really big companies that have started moving in that direction, like Facebook and Twitter and everybody else that recently announced it. Trying to lean on that, learning from that. I'm going to be spending a lot of time over the next few months thinking directly through that as to how I can kind of take that and implement that within the company.
Sam.
I was just going to add FaceTime. I think FaceTime is so hard to unlearn. It sounds easy and it sounds simple to unlearn, but it's really not. Like, you have these subconscious reactions to seeing people a lot in the office and hearing their voice a lot in meetings that I think is not really the way to evaluate somebody's performance for the most part. So you really have to intentionally figure out a way to measure results and measure performance differently, and train your own brain out of those old FaceTime habits. Because we're 5 years in and I still do that sometimes. So it's really, I think it's a long-term journey to get over that.
That resonates a lot with me. I feel like people know I'm working hard if I'm in the office a lot. And it's like, even the narrative for myself, it's like, oh, I'm grinding. I'm here. I'm in meetings. You hear me. It's not a productive narrative. I think at the end of it, after 25 years of thinking about it, it's not that productive. That's what quarantine has taught me. Okay.
And you judge yourself. Like, I think a lot of it is self-judgment as well. Like, sometimes I'll be in the middle of my day, and one of the nice things about working remotely is I can have a 30-minute lunch break and watch a TV show. But then I start, I'm watching TV and I'm having my salad and I'm like, I shouldn't be doing this. Like, this is bad. I shouldn't be doing this right now. So I think you might also be being hard on yourself in some ways in that regard. So,
final speed round. If you had to write the definitive book on the future of work post-pandemic, what would the title be? Matt.
Big Pivot. I've been like the Great Depression. I think this is going to be the Great Pivot or the Big Pivot because of what's happened with every company that you could possibly imagine, down to what we've been doing to Talk. I keep thinking about Talk as the prime example that I think about in Chicago, that's completely pivoted from a business that I thought would flat out be dead because of what's going on, and hasn't died, and they've grown, I think, and evolved from it. So seeing what kind of comes out the other side of this from a an entrepreneurial perspective of what might get invented, what might be created in this time, and who might pivot into something amazing.
Thank you. Brian.
To give you progress made, not time spent, right? So like we were just talking about FaceTime and how important it is for us to be seen grinding, and we lead by example in doing that, and our employees follow that, and that's something we have to break. And it's a wildly different world when you don't prioritize time spent on things and you prioritize the goals and metrics you're moving and the progress you're making. And it takes just a wholly different system and way of thinking to do that.
Sam.
The enriched employee. I just think people have the opportunity to really invest in themselves in ways that are unique to working remotely. And I'm really excited to see all the different concepts that support that.
And Colleen.
I think I would coin it empathy is productivity, and that we are going to be experiencing a fully human revolution of what work looks like, and that those, the learnings that we're building right now are kind of the prologue, right? Like we're not even in chapter 1. And so the uncomfortableness that we're experiencing right now is due to decades of kind of the wrong structures. And so I do believe that we're going to see a more human side of the future of work.
5 out of 5. You all nailed it. All books I would read. You're amazing. Thank you, Colleen, Matt, Brian, and Sam, for spending time and sharing your wisdom and perspective. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Guys.
Thanks, everybody. See ya. Bye.
Take it easy.